My name is Suwan. I'm 80 years old, and I want to begin with something that might make you uncomfortable before it makes you free. Your mind is not always your friend. I know that sounds strange coming from a monk. I know that in most spiritual traditions, the mind is spoken of with reverence, as the seat of wisdom, as the place where practice lives, as something to be purified and refined and trusted. And there is truth in all of that. But there is another truth that sits underneath it, a truth that most teachers speak around rather than directly at. A truth I avoided for most of my own practice, because confronting it required a kind of honesty that is harder than any meditation. The mind you are living inside right now, the one producing your fears, your judgments, your sense of who you are and what you deserve and what is possible for you, that mind is not always showing you reality. Very often, it is showing you its own conditioning, its own history, its own accumulated wounds and defenses and survival strategies. And it is presenting all of that to you as if it were the truth about the world. Maybe right now, something in you wants to push back against that. Maybe something in you says, "But my mind is all I have." Maybe you have spent years trusting your intelligence and your analysis and your careful thinking, and the idea that the very tool you rely on most is also one of your greatest obstacles feels like the ground shifting under your feet. If that is true, stay with me, because what I am going to share is not an attack on thinking. It is an invitation to see thinking clearly. And seeing it clearly is the beginning of a freedom that thinking alone can never produce. I was born in northern Thailand in a simple life that did not ask many philosophical questions. But from the time I was very young, my mind was active in a way that the life around me could not fully absorb. It turned things over. It asked why. It worried about what would happen. It replayed what had already happened. It compared everything to everything else and reached conclusions with a speed and confidence that I did not yet know to be suspicious of. When I entered the monastery, I brought all of that with me, and for a long time I mistook the activity of my mind for the practice of the mind. I thought the thinking I did about Dharma was the same as understanding Dharma. I thought the analyzing I did about my own practice was the same as deepening my practice. I thought the careful mental construction I maintained about who I was and where I was on the path was actually helping me walk it. You see, this is the deepest trick the mind plays. It tells you that it is helping. It presents every distortion as protection, every judgment as clarity, every fear as wisdom, every limitation as realism. And because the mind is the instrument you are using to evaluate whether the mind is telling the truth, the whole thing becomes a closed loop. You cannot use a crooked ruler to check whether the ruler is straight, and you cannot use a conditioned mind to fully see the conditioning of the mind. And here's what I didn't understand then. The mind that I trusted so completely was not an objective observer of reality. It was a deeply subjective interpreter of it. It had been shaped by everything that had happened to me, by the fear I had absorbed early, by the conclusions I had drawn from pain, by the strategies I had developed to stay safe and to stay acceptable, and to avoid the particular kinds of suffering that had hurt me most. All of that was invisible to me. It did not feel like interpretation. It felt like truth. The way you see through your eyes rather than seeing your eyes themselves. The mechanism that shapes everything you perceive is almost impossible to perceive directly. But the Buddha's path, when it is followed with genuine honesty rather than with the comfortable version of honesty most of us prefer, eventually points at exactly this. At the moment when you begin to see the mind seeing, when you notice the thought arising rather than simply having the thought, when you feel the interpretation forming rather than simply receiving the interpretation as fact. That moment of genuine seeing is what changes everything. Not because it fixes the mind, but because it removes the mind's total authority over your experience of reality. What most people don't realize is that most of their suffering does not come directly from what happens to them. It comes from the story the mind tells about what happens to them. And the stories the mind tells are not random. They are patterned. They follow the grooves of old conditioning. They interpret every new situation through the lens of every old wound. Someone is slightly distant, and the mind says, rejection. Someone gives you a piece of critical feedback, and the mind says you are fundamentally insufficient. Something uncertain appears on the horizon, and the mind says danger, before you have had any actual evidence of danger. These interpretations happen so quickly, so automatically, so completely below the threshold of conscious choice, that they feel like perception rather than construction. But they are construction, and they are built from the materials of your history, not the materials of the present moment. You know what surprised me most about this? When I first began to genuinely see it, I did not feel liberated. I felt grief, because I realized how much of my life had been spent inside stories that were not actually true, or not as true as I had believed. How many relationships I had experienced through the distorting lens of old fear. How many opportunities I had missed because the mind had categorized them through the framework of past failure. How many moments of genuine peace I had been unable to receive because the mind was busy producing reasons that things were not safe. The grief was real, but underneath it was something else, something I had not expected, a kind of relief. Because if the problem was the story rather than the fact, then the freedom was much closer than I had imagined. Let me explain what this looks like in practice, because it is easy to say the mind is not showing you reality, and very difficult to see in the actual texture of daily experience. The practice begins with small noticing. When something happens and a strong reaction arises, pausing just long enough to ask a different question. Not what is happening, but what is my mind saying about what is happening? Not what does this mean, but what is my mind assuming this means? That pause, tiny as it is, introduces a gap, and in that gap, the mind loses some of its authority. Not all of it, but some. And some is enough to begin. The practice deepens when you start to notice patterns. When you see that your mind tends to produce the same kinds of stories in the same kinds of situations. When you see that the fear that arises in intimacy and the fear that arises in uncertainty and the fear that arises when you are challenged, all have the same quality, the same flavor, as if they are different costumes worn by the same deeper anxiety. Seeing that is not comfortable, but it is the beginning of something much more honest than the endless management of individual reactions. And here's the part that monks often avoid saying directly. The mind can use spirituality as another form of defense. It can become very skilled at producing spiritual-sounding thoughts that are actually just more sophisticated versions of the old patterns. It can manufacture insights about non-attachment while secretly maintaining every attachment it has ever had. It can speak eloquently about impermanence, while clinging desperately to permanence in every practical choice. It can present itself as spiritual progress, while actually just elaborating its own defenses in higher resolution form. I know this because I lived it for years, and the recognition of it was one of the most humbling experiences of my entire practice. What actually breaks through this is not more thinking, not better concepts, not more sophisticated spiritual understanding held as mental content. What breaks through it is the genuine willingness to look at the mind from something other than the mind. And that something other in Buddhist practice is called awareness. Not thinking about awareness, awareness itself. The capacity to notice what is happening without being entirely inside what is happening. The space in which thought arises rather than the thought itself. This is not easy to develop, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It requires a particular kind of patience that is different from the patience of someone who is waiting for something to happen. It is the patience of someone who is genuinely willing to be with what is, including the mind's resistance to being seen, including the discomfort of watching yourself construct something you cannot immediately stop constructing. That patience is itself a practice, and it is built slowly through many ordinary moments of genuine noticing rather than a few dramatic breakthrough experiences. There is something I also need to say about the relationship between this understanding and self-compassion, because seeing the mind clearly can become another form of self-attack if it is not approached with genuine kindness. The mind's conditioning is not your fault. The fears it carries were learned from real experiences. The strategies it deploys were developed in the presence of real threats. Even the ways it distorts your perception of the present were originally attempts to protect you from what hurt most in the past. Seeing these things clearly does not mean condemning them. It means understanding them honestly enough that they lose some of their automatic power. And that understanding is always more possible when it is accompanied by the same quality of care you would offer to someone else who had developed exactly these patterns in exactly these circumstances. At 80 years old, I can tell you that my mind is still active. It still produces interpretations. It still sometimes runs old patterns in new situations. The difference is that I see it doing so more quickly now. I have a little more space between what the mind says and what I believe the mind is saying. And in that space, I make slightly different choices than I used to make. Not perfect choices, not enlightened choices, human choices, made with a bit more clarity than before. And that bit more clarity, accumulated over many years, is what I understand the genuine Buddhist path to actually produce. Not the transcendence of the mind, the transparency of the mind, the ability to see through it clearly enough that it no longer runs the whole show without your knowledge. If these words are landing somewhere real in you today, maybe this is the right moment to stay close to this space. Not because any words can do the whole work of this transformation, but because the direction matters. And once you have genuinely seen that your mind is not always showing you reality, you cannot fully go back to treating it as if it is. Something has changed, and that change, imperfect and incomplete as it always is the beginning of something real. Tell me in the comments what you have noticed your mind doing most consistently that does not actually serve you. What kind of story does it tell most reliably? What distortion does it produce most automatically? And if this message gave you something real to work with, stay close to this space, because this kind of clarity is built over time, and returning to it again and again is how the transparency deepens.